Dear audience, this is a very special session today, and I'm very pleased to be able to make a short introduction for you. My name is Joshua Grochban, and for the last 10 months, I've been part of the team that has worked voluntarily to organize this great conference focusing on intergenerational dialogue. We are connected with the Swiss Embassy in South Africa, one of our 3 international hubs in China, South Africa, and Mexico. I warmly welcome Madame Komurela Myambo Nuga, the former Deputy President of South Africa and former Executive Director of UN Women. Present right now at Embassy are roughly 30 guests, including members of our Leaders of Tomorrow community. The speaker, Komurela Myambo Nuga, is currently sitting in the room next to the audience, but there are follow-up discussions planned on site. We thank the Swiss Embassy in South Africa for supporting us in making this event possible. In this room, I welcome Professor Simon Evenet, who will be the moderator today and is director of the Swiss Institute for International Economics and Applied Economic Research at the University of St. Gallen. Next to him in the middle is Madame Christine Gold, who is the founder and chief executive officer of the Thought for Food Foundation. And last but not least, I want to welcome Madame Petra Laux, who is the global head of business sustainability and crop protection at Syngenta. As a young person who grew up in a Europe of peace, just like my parents' generation, the idea of war or food shortages is foreign to me, and I never thought about the complex supply chains of wheat and maize before the Ukraine war. What I find out in conversations with my friends and fellow students is that this is a very scary time for us students in particular. A conflict in mainland Europe could turn into a global humanitarian crisis that would hit Africa particularly hard. None of us knows how the situation will develop in the near future and to what extent it will affect us directly, and this uncertainty is frightening. I personally think that it's very important to talk about this topic, and I'm very excited about the dialogue and the speakers today. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you very much, Joshua, for that excellent introduction. Let's get straight into the panel. We'll go to our colleagues in South Africa and ask Your Excellency for her presentation and intervention. Please, Madam.
Thank you very much, and good morning to good afternoon to everybody in St. Gallen and in South Africa. The topic that we are discussing today of food security is very critical for all of us as we reflect our situation following the Ukraine war. We also are coming out of a pandemic which has created havoc in most of our economies. We also are living at a time when we are dealing with the many changes that we are in technology. We also are living at a time when climate change is upon us. So all of these issues are happening at the same time. I mean, that's the one thing that I would like to highlight about the war in Ukraine, that all of us are feeling as far as food security is concerned, is the issue of fertilizer. Because fertilizer that we use in the world that is cost effective comes from Ukraine. We in South Africa, for instance, I did not know, I only realized now, we actually are affected by the fertilizer of Ukraine. This has affected the cost of food and the rate at which we can produce. If I think about the threats of climate change and the possibility that in a couple of years we would not be producing enough food for ourselves to eat, I also am concerned that we do not have a youth population that is engaged with agriculture, that is informed, that is being educated to take agriculture into their own hands. So if anything out of this conversation that we must take away is really to think of a strategy to take the message out. Lastly, I also want to raise the issue of countries that are producing food, that are short of food, but producing gas and oil, the fossil fuels, which we do not want as far as climate change is concerned. Given that the fertilizer needs a product, oil, from gas in particular, how do we make these producers of gas turn their production and into producing for fertilizers and therefore for food production, and not for energy, which energy we are so concerned about? So these things are interdependent, and we just need and make the right choices. Thank you.
Thank you very much. May I hear your argument of interdependency, which I think is very well made, and the call for engagement with younger generations, which will certainly go down well at this symposium. But can I ask you what steps South Africa is taking to help alleviate any food security concerns? I think we may have been frozen a little bit here. We can certainly come back to our colleague in South Africa. Maybe I'll turn to Christine and ask her for her initial intervention.
Yeah, thanks so much, and welcome everybody to this, very important and aptly titled session, which actually has caused me over the past couple of weeks to really think deeply about this topic of interconnectedness. As an elder millennial and a digital native and a student of international affairs, I've actually, grown up really believing in the positive promises of globalization. But of course, I've also lived through and experienced the major global crises, such as the 2008 financial crisis, such as COVID-19, and what we're experiencing now with the brutal invasion of Ukraine by Russia, which has exacerbated a longstanding issue of food insecurity, something I've actually dedicated my entire life and career towards helping to address. And I think, what we're seeing is countries understandably looking towards how to localize supply chains, how to find local solutions. And what does that then leave for this interdependence that, we've actually built, over the past decades? And so in my work at Thought for Food, we're working actually with over 30,000 millennial and Gen Z innovators in 170 countries. And we're addressing one of the topics that Her Excellency spoke about, which is getting young people excited about and passionate about the opportunities in agriculture and food. But more importantly, we're also leaning into something that is the positive side of globalization and interconnectedness, which is the opportunity to be globally minded and to share and to cooperate towards solving the problems that we all face. Now, food and agriculture is very local, very contextual, and we need diverse solutions that fit into local contexts and are relevant in various situations. But we can accelerate the speed and impact of local innovation efforts by cooperating, and that's what digital technologies can allow us to do so profoundly in today's world, by building communities who are, aligned in a shared interest of addressing food insecurity, addressing climate change, and actually being the antidote to conflict. Because as the World Food Program won the Nobel Peace Prize last year. They're the second food-related organization to win the Nobel Peace Prize, the first one being Norman Borlaug, because food is the best vaccine against chaos. So when we can invest in food and innovation to tackle these challenges, and we can coordinate and cooperate globally, then we have a chance of doing things in new ways and solving this age-old problem. Because if we rely on our old systems, our old structures, our old mindsets that, scale is better, bigger is better, we won't get through this. We need faster, smaller, more agile, nimble innovation that can be accelerated through global cooperation. So that's my first intervention.
Thank you very much for that and for laying out your approach. Now,
Yeah.
could you very succinctly give us one example of progress that you've made which you're really proud of?
Well, we launched in 2020 the COVID Collaboration Collective, which was something that our innovators around the world came together and said, hey, I'm working on linking smallholders to markets here in Colombia. I have the same problem in India. What are you doing? And we were able to quickly share best practices, learning, data, et cetera, to accelerate everyone's efforts. She mentioned fertilizers, and actually right now we are running an innovation challenge on sustainable crop inputs that are looking for biological approaches to replace synthetic fertilizers all over the world. So there's some exciting innovation that we're going to be building from the ground up, and again, fostering collaborative innovation. Our innovation challenge is a collaborative challenge. So those are a couple of concrete examples that we hope can take forward solutions, because that's what we need now more than ever.
Thank you for that. And I think that's a great way of segueing to the private sector contribution. Petra, please.
Thank you, Simon. Thanks for the organizers for putting the issue of food security on the agenda again. It has not been in the policy focus for a while. It has been a bit neglected, and it's so important. And the trajectory where we're on has started off long before the Ukraine crisis, actually. So FAO says that the world hunger has increased by 27% between 2014 and 2020. Keep this in mind. Now, the World Hunger Report just issued last week says the causes for hunger, and 2021 was the record year of world hunger, is the 3 Cs. It's conflict, climate change, and cost. Caused by economic shocks and COVID pandemic and all of this. And if you look at the impact of climate change, which we all see, but we haven't actually looked at the impact on food production, the World Food Programme reported this month that actually the productivity growth of food has gone down by 20% due to global heating. This is a tremendous threat. And if you look at the impact of the Ukraine alone, Ukraine and Russia is supplying food to about 400 million people globally. It's 45 countries that import at least a third of their wheat from Ukraine and Russia. And so the impact is tremendous if we don't help farmers in Russia and Ukraine actually to keep producing and supplying. So this is a bit about the impact, but I wanted to also talk about the climate crisis and what we can do and the role of innovation. And if we think about the climate crisis, I've talked about the impact agriculture. I've talked about the role of climate in decreasing food supplies. And if we want to address this, we need obviously help farmers worldwide to produce more food on the existing agricultural land, to make up for the losses we are seeing elsewhere, to droughts, to conflict. And in order to do this, we need agricultural innovation, because this is no longer just about putting more fertilizer on the fields. We need to add and combine this with regenerative agricultural practices, and we need innovation that helps improve the environmental performance of agriculture. And such innovation is better seeds, which is drought resistant, flood resistance, produces more protein. It's about biostimulants that improve fertilizer efficiency. It's about seed treatments that increase root mass and that lead to more carbon in soil and less greenhouse gas emission. And it's about, again, helping farmers applying more regenerative practices. The last point quickly, which is super important, is we have forgotten the relevance of yield. We need yield increases not only for actually addressing the hunger, but also for addressing the climate crisis. The World Resources Institute has published last year that about 30% of the greenhouse reductions we need to achieve in agriculture come from yield increases. And the Bezos Earth Fund has said if we want to nourish the people in 2040 on the same amount of land, we need to double our yield increases. That's a grand challenge. And I hope society will embrace modern technologies like new breeding techniques and biologicals, because this is what we need to help produce safe food for all. Thank you.
Thank you. One dimension you didn't mention, but I know is dear to your heart, is also the fact that we have to keep cross-border movement of goods and ideas and intellectual property going. So how central is that, and how worried are you about some of the trends that we're seeing worldwide at the moment?
It's very relevant to keep market open. We have talked about this interconnectivity, and we see actually hurdles to trade, and that also means hurdles to development, for example, of the African nations, being impacted by minimum residual level policies that deviate from what science would dictate. And we see this with some worries, and we know that it's a big problem for the developing of African countries.
I'm happy to see our colleagues in South Africa are back. And I just to let you catch up, we have been talking solutions provided, driven somewhat by civil society and collaboration across the world. And also now...
Oh, no.
The question I put to you, Funzile, was one of what is South Africa doing to help alleviate the current food security concerns? Are there any really interesting ideas you can share with us today?
Yeah. Well, our research institutions are obviously quite concerned about the subject and looking forward. And I think the little that I heard from the last speaker is exactly what we would be concerned about in South Africa. How can we look at innovation as the important way of addressing our threats of food insecurity? But in South Africa, we also have a lot of rural communities which are underproductive, who do not have adequate access to land. So the issue of access to land to begin with is quite important. We have not addressed it adequately. It is something that the citizens have to address, put pressure on government so that government makes the right moves so that ordinary people can access land that they can grow, and scientists hopefully can bring about information, interventions that are scientifically proven to lead us to higher productivity. So I guess what I would say is that it's work in progress. We recently had floods in KwaZulu-Natal, which killed almost 400 people, and people's houses were collapsed. And that was a wake-up call for all of us on all fronts. And I'm hoping that as a result of what has happened in KwaZulu-Natal, we are even more anxious now to address all of these issues that come with climate change, including food production, as well as the use of science and innovation to improve our productivity.
Thank you for that. Christine wanted to, I think, make an intervention.
I did, yes. I think that, you talked about a very, comprehensive set of innovations and solutions that are really important to focus on right now. And I just wanted to emphasize that it is about taking a systemic approach. innovation needs to come through a new lens to get through this crisis, to get through the convergence of crisis that we're experiencing right now, with the climate emergency, and to come out better than, we ever have before. And we do have this unprecedented challenge of feeding 10 billion people on a hotter planet. And so when we talk about yield increases, it's not enough. We have to have yield increases and nutrition increases. And they can go hand in hand when you implement regenerative agricultural practices. And you're looking at things like soil health and preserving biodiversity. Last year, I had the chance to serve on the advisory committee for the UN Food Systems Summit. And it was a really interesting effort by the United Nations to bring together a multitude of actors working on, food, agriculture, economic development, women's empowerment, all of climate change, of course, all of these issues which are affected by and affecting each other. And this is how we need to start thinking and acting to get through this crisis. It's too easy to say, oh goodness, look at this, food insecurity is on the rise. We have to address this quickly, using the same thinking and same actions, that got us into this mess in the first place. And so we have to actually be brave enough to address this, look at addressing the prevailing issues that countries are facing that are very dire, but in new ways, and being brave enough to say it's about integrating these solutions and going beyond just a yield increase type of focus. Not to say we don't need yield increases, but we need more.
So I coach lots of panels and I hear people linking lots of issues in different ways, and everyone says we need an integrated approach and we need new thinking. Mm-hmm. I don't often hear too much new thinking about integrated approaches.
Well,
so what
come
is
to thought for food. Yeah.
No, but I mean, when you look around the world, is there do you think a country or a region that is on track?
Well, yeah, I think that there's some work right now in, for example, the plant-based sector. So there's a lot of investment dollars going into making a transition into plant-based futures. And now there are, research institutes saying that actually, like Good Food Institute is one that comes to mind, and Singapore actually with their 30 by 30 initiative, which is linked to some of the work that they're doing, saying we need to not just move towards a plant-based future, but we need to look at diversification of the supply chain. We need to look at how growers are growing these crops so that we can have inclusive business models that are supporting smallholder farmers. I'm now really excited to see some of the new business models that the Web3 phenomenon is now being applied into food and agriculture. I also love every opportunity I have to talk to telecommunications and tech companies, because also making internet access more pervasive is going to be game-changing for a lot of the solutions that we need. So it's about connecting dots. And what I also see, going to the question of this, session around interdependence, is that, with our world's next generations who have grown up globally connected and, with the power of digital technologies in their hands, there's a lot that we could be doing to, get that natural tendency for dot connecting that exists in them more mainstream into food and ag. And I implore the private sector to invite new parties to the table and break out of echo chambers.
Well, I think that's a good opportunity to ask Petra what partnerships Syngenta's been developing. I'm sure you have several.
So we start off, our primary purpose is, of course, to help farmers fighting climate change and provide food. And then we try to build and help with the ecosystem around, right? So we have a partnership with the Nature Conservancy, who helps us figure out what is the environmentally good, safe way to produce food. And then we partner down the value chain with food companies like Kellogg's, Pepsi, Nestle, to discuss with them what is the attributes of the commodities the farmer produce and what does the end consumer want to see. And we have one project in China where we actually connect end-to-end the farmer to the consumer in the supermarket, so a project which we call Map Beside. And on the map beside, you find on every produce a stamp which says, this is the place where it has been produced, this is the environmental footprint of it, this is the quality you can expect. And so the consumer has the full transparency of the produce he or she buys.
Thank you. I think we should turn now to our participants here to see if they have any comments or questions. I'd like to take questions in groups of 3, if we may. So we have one person, we have 2 people right there. There's a mic coming over, and then there's one in the center. So let's get 3 questions on the table and go back to our colleagues.
Hello. Yeah, my name is Nils Deversköld. I'm a farmer from South Sweden. So I would like to ask the question about GMO. If you're going to increase yields, double the yield, and Europe does not support the research of GMO, how are you going to handle it?
Thank you. I like short questions. Let's get another short question in, please. Good.
So it is widely well known now that in any type of crisis, it is the poor and vulnerable who suffer the most, and that will be true with the food crisis and the hunger that we will be facing in some time as well. So how do we ensure protection of the poor and vulnerable in the time of such crisis? Thank you.
Thank you. I think there was a question in the middle here. Someone had their hand up. Yes. Over here, please. Okay, thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Yves Royst. I'm a vivid meditator, and I'd like to bring up the topic of perceiving change. If we look at Otto Scharmer, that teaches at MIT, he says we need not to change paradigms, but the perception of problems. And you showed a good example of people seeing actually who produces and as such feeling interconnected. So I'd like this to be picked up as well, that perception of change in all of our minds.
Yep.
Thank you. So let's turn back to the panel. Who would like to take the question on of how we help the poorest and the most vulnerable? Maybe Funzile, could you speak to that, please?
Yes. Well, firstly, I want to say the one group in society that is affected, that is vulnerable and poor, it's women. In the majority of poor countries, women are the majority food producers. They, in most cases, do not own the land. So even though they till, they are not as well positioned as they can be, because I mean land is such a valuable asset. So gender inequality is important in this mix because it also affects the poor and the way they are treated. Access to productive resources, be it land, money, equipment, and everything that you need in order to produce is going to be important. And this is something that I think by large has to be a problem of governments. They must make policies that work in favor of this very valuable and productive group and groups of any sort in any country, so as to make sure that people who are helping to produce the food in our countries are treated much better and encouraged to produce even more.
Thank you very much. Maybe we could turn to Petra, and the question about GMOs must surely animate you.
There was data released a couple of months ago from the University of Bonn, which says that using GMO in Europe could increase food production by, I think it was something like 20 to 30%, but don't nail me down on the number. I think the debate will not be reopened, but what I really very much hope is that there will be support for the new breeding techniques. New breeding techniques accelerate traditional breeding. It helps in a very targeted manner to insert traits into crops that have special features like drought resistance, flood resistance, producing more protein in a grain, or disease resistance. So with this technology, we hope that needs to be regulated. We hope that we can have access also in Europe to modern technology.
Thank you. Christine, would you like to address the question on change and the perception of change?
Yeah, sure. So you talked about Otto Scharmer and the Presencing Institute as an organization. We've collaborated with at Thought for Food. And one of the things that he talks about is the movement from ego mindset to eco mindset, and this, realizing that we are part of ecosystems. And so when we're talking about change, I think for entrepreneurs, which I have the, pleasure of working with, change and problems are opportunities. And when you think about doing change and nudging change and creating transformative change, when you think about that through an ecosystem lens, you realize that change isn't big and insurmountable. It's a lot of small experiments happening all the time, all over the place, with people who support you and are learning from each other. And so this, I think, is a profound way to create change, again, is to be inspired by how nature innovates and bring that into how we humans, as interconnected, we are nature, actually, beings can create change. And so it doesn't have to be something to be, afraid of. It can be something that we, can support each other through. And I just want to make one last quick thing about the GMO comment. I don't know if I'm going to win any friends here, but I actually was showing this earlier, but I have a I love GMO sticker on my phone, which I proudly wear. And you might think I got that from a big bad behemoth, industry company. I actually got this from a startup who's working on using the power of genetic engineering to do some really incredible things for our food system, and they're democratizing access to their intellectual property through open source approaches, again, thereby giving more people in more places the power to tinker with, understand, and create beneficial solutions for people that can solve some of the biggest challenges we face on the planet. So if you do want to talk about GMOs, it's my favorite topic, so happy to take any side questions.
So let's get some more questions, please. And our colleagues in South Africa can pose questions as well. I see one hand up here. We have two over here. So let's begin over on the right side and then go to the left, please.
Thank you, Professor. My name is Juan. I'm with the Leaders of Tomorrow cohort. So yesterday I was listening to the Swiss president, and he was talking about the role of Switzerland in neutrality. And as the conflict is escalating all around the world, I was thinking at some point we will need one Switzerland per continent. But just to get to the point, is there any room in international cooperation to make a shift to assure that the production of food is guaranteed by more neutral countries with more at some point reliable neutral countries? Is like for international cooperation structure. I mean, that's the question.
Thank you. And I would just add that the president of the World Bank recently called upon the major exporters of different crops to commit not to disrupt the exportation of them. So very much in the same spirit. We have two hands up over here. One colleague here, I see. And a microphone is now there with you.
Thank you. My name is Hibat Larabishi. I'm a Swiss-Syrian student here at the University of St. Gallen with the Leaders of Tomorrow. So my question would be to Christina Gould. You mentioned Web 3.0 in agriculture, and I would be really interested in the applications of this in reducing food security and also maybe the role of the metaverse in increasing equity. So that would be my question. Thank you.
Thank you. We had another third question here before we go back to the panel.
Thank you. My name is Julia Newbarrow. I'm a partner with Aconnect, a global consulting firm, and I run our agribusiness, food and chemicals practice. My question is, there is a big dichotomy, and we spoke a little bit about this, between sort of food security at the global level, but then also in developing countries, in developed countries where you have consumers wanting more and more specific goods, more and more tailor-made, more and more traceable. You have a lot around clean label, traceability, sustainability, and obviously awareness around sustainability. How do you, from a private sector perspective and also from a public sector perspective, look at this also in the longer run, and how do you see this development and see it being managed?
Thank you for these questions. I think I'd like to go back to South Africa to ask our former Deputy President of South Africa what international initiatives could help stabilize the supply of food in your opinion? You've worked in the UN system, so you have some experience of that. What do you think we could do at the global level or even at the regional level?
Yeah. I think encouraging agriculture in every country. We were discussing here in South Africa earlier how much we feel our young people in urban areas, for instance, don't know much about agriculture, and they don't see themselves as people who are connected to food production system. So this issue of knowledge and exposure remains very important in our country. I mean, we are concerned that in a couple of years, we will not have farmers as we know them. I think from WFP, World Food Program, in Southern Africa, they were saying that a lot of people who have produced food for us in Southern Africa over many years have become much older. There has not been a generation coming after them which has been trained in the same way. And they are worried that we are continuously reducing the number of people who are actively farming. So if we do not focus on bringing new farmers in an intentional way, we really run a risk of cutting ourselves off from food production. We need to make agriculture really attractive to young people. At least everybody needs to eat. That I think they understand, but I don't think that they see themselves as parts of that value chain. And of course, let us make sure that the role of women in food production is also given the attention it deserves. The big farmers, I am not dismissing them. They also remain important. But, you know, those are big boys. They know how to fight for themselves. But there's a whole group in society that we also need to cater for so that we can increase the number of people that are participating in food production.
That is an important medium and longer term goal or lofty goal. But is there anything in the short run you feel that could be done through international cooperation? Especially with respect to insecurity concerns.
Yeah, I think at an international level, we need to look at the rules of globalization and what they have brought into how goods move around the world. I I think that the fact that we have allowed a situation where the countries that produce that are the cheapest in production of certain foods to dominate the market is a problem, because we've killed the incentive and the potential of other countries to remain active and to produce. We need to rethink, now that we know that supply chains can be as disrupted as they've become. We need to really think about the cost of having dismantled all the production systems in certain countries because we thought importing was cheaper. Not only did we take jobs in those countries where we dismantled the production systems, we are also taking away food potentially from those countries for the long term. So in the way in which we support policies, we look at policies at an international level within the United Nations, we need to be thinking about the decentralization of production of food, so that as many countries as possible are able to be self-reliant. I think we saw the issue of depending on too few countries to produce everything for everyone now during COVID, when a handful of countries that could produce a vaccine for themselves firstly overproduced for themselves and left a whole world outside that production. So yeah, it is a time for us to reconsider the way in which we think about production and the transportation of goods and services around the world.
Of the world trading system in food and vaccines. Let's turn, Christine, there was a particular question directed to you.
Yeah, about Web3 and use cases in food and agriculture. I definitely think maybe to the organizers of the St. Gallen Symposium that could be a whole session for next year's event. I implore anybody who's new to the Web3 space to push yourself to think past the hype and the pixelated digital images that are grabbing headlines with NFTs, to think about the underlying principles that is driving interest and investment into this space. The word decentralization was mentioned by me, by Her Excellency, and I think that is this decentralized opportunity that's coordinated through cooperation is what Web3 enables. So let me give you some specific examples. Of course, I've been seeing, because I've been working in the space of innovation and entrepreneurship for so many years, I've been seeing blockchain-based solutions. And, now they're actually making a difference. The technology has caught up with what the hype has been about. So blockchain and smart contracts can actually cut out the middleman. And I think we all know the story of the greedy middleman in many sectors, but in food and ag, there's a lot of adulteration of food products, honey, olive oil, and there's a lot of value captured in that middle segment that doesn't go back to the grower. And so with, potential use cases of blockchain and smart contracts, you can automate payments back to smallholders. You can look to things like NFTs to disrupt the venture capital model. How can we actually start investing in early stage startups all over the world through buying, equity shares into them via NFTs? Another interesting use case you mentioned, the metaverse. Right now, ag extension needs to be disrupted. One of the ways that we will improve yields and actually help farmers transition to use more innovations and adopt agronomic practices like regenerative ag is to train them. But the way we do ag extension is from, it's historical. It's, really, really needs a new type of approach. And here comes some opportunities in Web3 where you can do virtual trainings. You can actually have people, we've seen, I'm sure, YouTube videos of people fixing their sink, with virtual reality. The metaverse is going to take some of these things into the 22nd century or even the 21st century for that matter. So I do think there's some really exciting use cases that are on the cusp. We have to keep our minds open to explore them and not be caught up in the hype, because too much ag innovation is surrounded by hype, but say, how can we use these types of phenomenons for good and for practical implementation on the ground? And so maybe another session next year, we could bring some of the innovators I know in this space and explore that more deeply.
Petra, maybe you could take on the question of the increasing micro customization of consumers' needs or demands, and also if you have any reflections on how the world trading system could better support the dissemination of productivity improving agricultural innovations.
Absolutely, and if I may, a quick word on digitalization,
please,
because of course we are in the midst of this, and what we try to achieve, we try to improve decision making for farmers by offering all sorts of digital help, by photographing the fields, understanding the pest pressures, knowing exactly when to protect their crops, how much fertilizer to be used. So there's a huge digital revolution coming, and we want to enable farmer to take decisions not only on average data, but on my situation and my field to achieve the best sustainability. That's what we are working towards with our crop-wise programs. Now, to come to the what do we do in developing countries, right? In developed countries with the increasing consumer needs. So ideally, we would have a system where we would label our food depending on what is the nutrition value. Already that is hugely under discussion, but also where has it been grown, how has it been grown, and there are various hurdles to this in execution, even though we are discussing also with the value chain. One is the inability of traders to separate big commodities, because it's all you can imagine. You pump all corn into one ship, right? And it's very hard to separate these trading pathways. The others is we have seen there is very limited willingness of the end customer to buy or to pay a premium, and because we in various discussion could never establish a real value capture at the farm level, it's very hard for us with our programs to establish and incentivize farmer for even more sustainable production, because there is no business model for sustainability at farm level. And so it's really a lot of work to line all of this up. The one example which we have in today's developed world is the organic labels. And while this is one way to look at farming, we believe in today's world it's not the solution, because organic farming has yield reductions of 20 to 40%, and we believe we cannot afford this on a global scale, because it was increased land use massively. But this is an example where it worked, and we are trying and exploring other ways, but we are not there yet. You said on the global trading systems, we saw it in COVID, and we hope to see it also in this crisis. So food is human right. Seeds are excluded from all sanctions, for example. So the borders are being kept open for agricultural inputs. We saw this during COVID. The borders were kept open, so our workers were allowed to come to the factories to produce what is required, and keep food as a human right, and food and the means to produce food as an essential good. I think with this in mind, we can achieve a lot.
Thank you. Let's take some more comments and questions. We have one right in the center at the back there, and then two more in the center as well. And Oliver has one from South Africa. Okay, let's do four then. Oliver, go for it.
So I think there's a question from South Africa. Valentine, it's your time to shine.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. My name is Gugulethu Mfupi. I'm a financial journalist and broadcaster based here in South Africa. What we've witnessed through the conversation today, and of course the overriding themes of the last few decades, is that developed economies together with emerging markets have found alignment in order to facilitate trade between these regions and nations when it comes to food trade. But what are we seeing, and what do we need to explore in terms of seeking alignment and areas of collaboration to address food insecurity between both emerging markets and developed economies? I'd like to address this question to our colleagues who are based in Europe.
Thank you. So we have a question here as well, in the center.
Hendrik Leber from Frankfurt, Germany. You mentioned the long-term perspective, especially regarding this year and next year. What can the big seed providers like Syngenta and Corteva and others, and the four trading companies, the ABCD companies, do in a concrete way to help us in this current crisis?
Thank you. We have a gentleman here to ask the question. Okay. We'll come back. Don't worry. Please go ahead.
Very much. So we've been talking about food insecurity a bit, and there's another aspect to food that is nutrition that's also very essential. Mm-hmm. And in countries like in India and countries in Africa, for example, there's a lot of discussion around food fortification, for example, making the food that we serve more nutritious. There's a lot of discussion around meeting recommended dietary allowances. Mm. How is all of that being affected by the current food crisis? Thank you.
Thank you. Let's come back to our panel. I'm going to encourage everyone to be succinct because we've got demand for more questions. So, Petra, do you want to handle the question which was put to us from the colleague from Frankfurt?
Concretely, we are standing side by side with the farmers in the Ukraine and trying to make farming safer and make sure they have all the supplies they need. So concretely, that means we help them with logistics. We try to broker lorries who transport the goods. The biggest problem currently is that they can't empty their silos to harvest to store them this year's harvest. And finally, we are also de-risking farmers. we are selling essential inputs on credit with a high risk of default. So for us, our presence in the Ukraine is currently about keeping the system going with no immediate expectation on returns. The same applies to the whole region, because we also believe that Russia needs to be enabled to keep exporting grains and make its contribution. Our ambition in the Ukraine is we have delivered all seeds that is required for this year, and the majority of crop protection is in the country, so our ambition is to enable Ukraine to supply 2/3 of what it would normally supply, but that's not in our hands, but that's what we work towards.
Thank you. Christine, could you take on Valentine's question from South Africa about food security?
Yeah, so if I understood the question correctly, it was around alignment of areas of collaboration between developed and emerging economies. Is that what you understood too? Okay, so I think that we all share on this planet the challenge of how are we going to feed 10 billion people by 2050 on a hotter planet. And where we need to collaborate on is achieving that goal in a sustainable, inclusive way. And to the other question that was raised about nutrition, that's a shared goal. And I see that there's a huge opportunity where, for example, developed countries are very interested in combating non-communicable diseases such as obesity and diabetes through, transition to plant-based foods. And, instead of necessarily relying on the corn, soy, wheat and rice paradigm that currently dominates our food system, there's the chance to look towards new and currently underutilized crops that come from many emerging economies and can be bolstered and taken into our food system more prominently. So those are some areas of cooperation. I think it's really just like climate change is an all-encompassing challenge, and we need to be sharing intellectual property, and we need to also be looking towards, looking at these nutrition solutions that we need and how we can learn from and leverage leapfrog opportunities that can come from emerging economies.
And I'd like to go to Pumzile in South Africa. We had an interesting question about not just food, but nutrition, which I guess one way of thinking about that question is to say, how have the disruptions that we've seen in the last 2 months affected not just the amount of food, but the type of food that people are being able to eat and enjoy in South Africa?
Well, I have not definitely experienced the shift in South Africa in that regard. But what I could probably talk about is what I see in the school system, the way the patterns of eating amongst children, where the food that is being provided to children is fortified. This is something that the teachers and the school system now understands very well, and they are able to provide children with food that is fortified and nutritious. We also have a high increase in South Africa of children that are starting schools because of the increase of children who are able to attend early childhood development, and therefore increasing the numbers of the children who will be ready to start the school system. And if you consider that those are the years in a child's development that needs the child to be fed well, it is something that we should be very concerned about, that the teachers at the foundation phase understand very well how the children must eat. But if I look at the statistics, the data on the impacts of the pandemic, I think in middle of 2021, UNDP was telling us that the majority of the people affected by the pandemic were women, especially young women in their 20s and 30s. and that we needed to be worried about their nutrition, because most of them are also childbearing and most of them have young children. So whatever food they find for themselves goes to the children and everyone else that is in the household. They are always the ones that eat last and eat less. So it is a subject of concern, that when there is an opportunity to intervene, we must make sure that we are responding to those needs as well.
Round of questions. We have a gentleman here who's been very patient in the middle. No, here, please, down in the middle, here in the center. Thank you. And then we have a couple more as well. Please, sir.
Hello. Thank you. I'm Chukwudike Okeji by name, a student at Imperial College London. My question is around food waste. Like, we have been saying a lot about food production, but I think food waste is another issue we need to give a consideration to, because I think what the major problem is someone who needs to fix the friction between the haves and the have-nots. People have a lot and they tend to like throw away the excess, while some people at the lower end doesn't even have anything. So if we can find a way to fix the friction, that would be great. Like, when I moved to the UK, that's when I found out that there are some startups working in this area. I used some apps and I see that some restaurants, instead of throwing the food away, they sell it at cheaper prices to students. And that way they tend to like cut down the food that gets wasted. And I also think they are doing some good things in converting waste food to electricity, to energy, biogas. And this is something that is not really, I don't know, it's not really in focus right now in most developing countries. So I don't know how we can help them to catch up.
Okay.
So I don't know if your organization is doing anything in this area. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Let's get two more comments in quickly before the time runs out. We have one hand up here. We have one hand there and one there. Please.
Thank you. I'm Olivia. I work for a company that actually produces machines for food production. So we're also working in wheat production. And so from discussions with our customers, I realized that what you said before, that consumers often do not want to put in the extra money, that actually really hurts their margins, and they are really working on low margins. So what I see in the French market now is that farmers actually decided to stop farming and actually produce energy. So they give away their fields to put huge solar fields on it, or wind parks, because this is much more interesting financial-wise. So how can we, especially I would say in developed countries, stop this tendency? Because this will again increase prices, it will increase food shortage, and I think it will especially hurt again the poor.
Thank you. The last question is at the back, a gentleman just standing up there. Please give him the mic. And then...
I'll be quick. Thank you so much.
Good.
Firstly, thank you, Christine, for using the word Web3 and not crypto. I work at a company called Gitcoin, and we build and fund digital public goods. Every quarter, we give millions of dollars to grantees. So I'm increasingly convinced that food security should be a public good. So my question actually is for everybody, which is, what should I help to fund that could help make food security a public good? Thank you.
Thank you. Great question. Right, back to the panel. Let's do it in reverse order. Petra, which of these questions would you like to take on?
I think the field food and farming question. So if you think of food security, the immediate measures governments could take is, of course, to change the incentives and to give more incentives for food over feed production and for food over fuel production. But that's a political decision, and I believe, and this comes also with the food waste, we also need to remind ourselves of our power as consumers. So if we ask for transparency, if we ask for business models for sustainability at farm level that make it worse for farmers, to, as you described, then we are on the right track. We just need to be louder and more present in this debate.
Thank you. Christine, please.
Well, yeah, I wanted to talk about the food waste question, if that's okay, and then maybe I can talk with Gitcoin later. But the food waste question, I mean, 1/3 of all of our food is wasted. It's a huge issue. It happens, you know, mainly like on farms and at the retail level. There's a lot of opportunity to combat this. You mentioned some of the food waste apps that are there. I'm also particularly really excited about how we can design out food waste. For example, you know, preventing food waste in the first place by making sure, again, through digital collaboration, that we're planting the right crops at the right time so that we're not having massive surpluses, that we're able to connect smallholders to markets efficiently so their food doesn't rot in the fields. And also there's some cool AI-powered tools that when, you know, food is centralized, it can go to the right place at the right quality level. Not everybody needs a perfect avocado or perfect strawberries for whatever their use is. So there's so much innovation, and I guess that's my main message from all of the questions here today is, you know, there's a world of opportunity to innovate and solve these challenges in new, holistic ways. So everyone is affected by and affecting the food system. We all have a role to play, so dive in wherever you can, innovate, support innovation, and I believe we can do this.
Thank you. And now we go back to Madam Deputy President. Please, your closing remarks.
Yeah, well, I mean, I would close by also answering the question on the public goods. Just between 2019 to now, the number of people who are food insecure increased from 27 million to 44 million. And this in particular was pushed by the pandemic, as well as people who are living in areas of conflict. So if you look at this increase of food insecure people, as a result of externalities that, well, some we cause them, and some are causes that we cannot help. And then we think that the food production is going to shrink. So the number of people who will be food insecure will increase, not because they cannot afford, because food is not there. It makes it a more serious issue. If we don't see food as a public goods where we are able to put a lot of public resources into the safety of the production and the distribution of food, we obviously are looking at a much more difficult situation. It therefore becomes important that government, private sector, civil society needs to really work together on a plan that does not only cater for those who can afford, but in particular also cater for those who can't afford, recognizing that even those who can afford may actually face challenges if we don't all work together in creating a system that makes food accessible and available.
Very much for those comments and a plea for inclusivity as well. Colleagues, this has been a very interesting and stimulating panel. I'd like you to thank the speakers here and in South Africa. And we should not forget the organizing committee, as well as the Swiss Embassy in South Africa. So let's thank them as well. Thank you.
And our moderator.
And lastly, let's thank the audience for some great questions, putting some interesting topics on the table, and also the promise of support for solutions. So thank you to you as well. Have a good afternoon.
And our moderator.